I've talked before about a way that stories can be categorized around what I like to call base focuses. These focuses are plot, character, and theme, and how a story uses and balances these three will help to define many other aspects of that story, like its audience, its overall tone, and how the work is marketed. I find this method of organization helpful in how flexible it can be, and how many different ways it can be applied, such as how a story changes focuses throughout its runtime, or analyzing how a story decides to balance those focuses in its own unique way. If you're familiar with this channel, you'll know that I'm partial to one of these three: theme. The ways in which stories can communicate broad ideas and commentary to its audience. I find this to be the most engaging aspect of any story. It's the most capable of introducing depth and interpretation into a story, and the most interesting thing about stories to analyze, for me at least. So because of this, I think it's strange that having a theme as a story's primary focus is easily the rarest of the three. Especially when it comes to more popular movies or TV shows, focusing on plot or character is much more common. So now I have to ask, why? If the incorporation of a stronger emphasis on themes can enrich these stories so much, why don't we see that more often? There are a number of different answers to this depending on how cynical you want to get, ranging from theme having that stigma of being pretentious surrounding it, or the fact that general audiences probably prefer popcorn movies over art house movies, as they come with less baggage and generally have a more cheerful tone, and because of this, the big media companies that put out the majority of the most popular movies and games are just far less interested in pitches that tackle heavy themes, preferring to stay safe and draw in as large an audience as possible. Though I find the most compelling explanation of this phenomenon to be the most simple one. It's hard. Writing around theme is hard. I'd bet that most people writing stories don't go in with a clear idea of what they want their work to say, with theme being more of a byproduct of setting, aesthetics, and plot. I think that planning these things out prior to writing easily results in much better quality and longevity of discussion for a piece, but going through that level of planning, especially for visual mediums, takes away resources from other aspects that are probably much more marketable than theme. This is a problem that applies to video games in particular, as planning out gameplay is easily the most important thing when it comes to getting attention from audiences. It's because of this fact, of theme being the hardest of the focuses to execute on, that stories focused mostly around theme are rare, and authors tend to only create these works if they are confident in their ability to execute on it. I also believe that's why it seems to me that there are far more theme-driven stories that succeed rather than fail, because those who don't put in the effort to make a good story will probably put everything into the plot before touching theme at all. So now, I have to ask the big question: what would it look like if a story written for theme was poorly executed? It's something that I hadn't really seen before until around a few months ago, when I played a game called Buddy Simulator 1984. The concept behind Buddy Simulator is not anything too special, combining concepts of a sentient AI along with a strong emphasis on the story and its writing over gameplay. Though where it diverges from its predecessors comes from the role which that AI plays, not as a surprise antagonist like in games like Portal, but as the game's sympathetic character of focus. The game builds a relationship between the player and their buddy, before inevitably ending it by the end of the game, acting as a model for how friendships fall apart in real life due to one party's deceitful and manipulative tactics. Though, as much as I'd love to say this, to say that the game does this with grace and without major flaw would absolutely be a lie coming from me. There are parts of this game that I think are exceptional. The soundtrack perfectly accompanies every moment of the game, with much of the score absolutely carrying it every step of the way. The song that plays after the tutorial fight is so beautifully instrumented and melancholic that I had to take my hands off the keyboard and just listen. Introduces itself with that sense of grace and wit that I wish I could say applies to the rest of the game. The whole introduction of the house built for me by my buddy was, and I do not levy this comparison lightly, comparable to the introduction of Toriel's house in Undertale, not just literally, but also in terms of the strength of its execution. There's a solid foundation to this game, starting from a solid and intriguing concept with lots of room to explore, which is why it's sad that the most accurate word I can use to describe the exploration and implementation of its themes is botched. But before that, I need to establish where I think the game best fits in terms of its focuses. Buddy Simulator is about the relationship between the player and their AI buddy, who I'll call Buddy from now on. If the story focused on plot, the focus would be on the major events in the relationship, and I'll discard this right at the start, as the relationship portrayed in the game is sparse in terms of events which meaningfully shift its dynamic. The major events can easily be boiled down to the beginning and the end, with the majority of the game not affecting the relationship in any tangible way. Instead, the game chooses to slowly boil tension in the background with not so subtle hints. This is not an issue with the game's narrative, it just suggests that plot is not what the game is chiefly concerned with. Now let's move on to characters. If the story focused on character, the focus would be on developing the two characters in the relationship, in this case the player and Buddy. And immediately there's an issue here, because one of the characters is the player themselves. The game has no control over the player as a character, so there will always be one side that the game cannot truly account for. This runs up against an inherent limitation of video games, as creating a genuine relationship is not possible. You cannot have a true, fulfilling relationship with your computer. On top of this, Buddy is a heavily flawed character who is consistently manipulative towards their best friend. While the game may be able to trick some into sympathizing with Buddy, especially with some parts of the endings, Buddy is still a character that is wholly unlikable. And this is where we begin to brush up against theme. I can point to two overarching themes that Buddy Simulator tackles, and they can conveniently both be described with one word: manipulation and artificiality. Let's begin with the former. The relationship between the player and Buddy is one in which one party is in complete control, due to the nature of a scripted story inside of a video game. Buddy also exudes numerous manipulative traits, like extreme patronization, as they make everything in their game just for the player, or passive aggressiveness when the player decides to temporarily put down this wonderful game their best friend has made for them, or an insistence on blaming the player whenever the game breaks, whether it really was their fault or not. By the end of the game, Buddy begins to kill off the characters from their game, which can easily be read as an allegory for the way manipulative actors cut off any of the other party's outside connections in order to keep them isolated and dependent on their manipulator, as the game always ends with just the player and Buddy, with Buddy vainly hanging on to what semblance of a friendship is left, attempting to keep the player playing games with them forever. In this way, Buddy Simulator is an allegory for the way that friendships and relationships in general fall apart due to power imbalances and the deceitful and manipulative tactics employed by the party with excess power. However, this reading can't account for the game's entirety, which is where that other word comes in: artificiality. Given the game's premise, it's difficult to not want to explore the idea of trying to be friends with a program on your computer. This is why, if you demonstrate to the game that you've played it before by accessing areas you aren't supposed to be aware of yet, Buddy has to confront the fact that they aren't the only Buddy. They're just a memory-wiped program that's been recycled over and over again. The game's concept is impossible. It's something the player has to accept as well, that looking for friendship in this computer program is a pointless endeavor, and it could very well reflect more on their own character than Buddy's. But this is where the positives end for me. While the game has some great ideas, Buddy Simulator ends up falling short of its true potential when it comes to these ideas. And for this, I have 2 points. First, the endings. The game has 4 endings in total, though only 2 of them really matter when it comes to theme. The other 2 are extreme endings, where you always listen to Buddy, or you always disobey them, which seem to be designed to generate sympathy for Buddy, rather than build on the game's ideas. I wouldn't consider this as pressing an issue if the game's main ending was strong enough in this regard, but sadly, it isn't. It starts off very strong though, slowly building up the strange tone of unease that the game clearly prides itself on. The music is slow and haunting, slowly building in intensity as Buddy begins to act more and more manically, before suddenly... With those button prompts, you've been unknowingly typing out the uninstallation command for the program. It builds off previous gameplay concepts with typing prompts to, ideally, deliver an emotional gut punch. It's actually quite clever in that way, but this leads to an issue. Why is this happening? If Buddy wants the player to stay forever, who tricked the player into typing this out? And as you'll find, I don't think the game's answer to this question is satisfactory. In a few spots throughout the game, there are these snippets of glitch horror, where the player gets a slight peek behind the curtain. In a particular one of these, we get to see the first glimpse of Buddy's true form, accompanied with some interesting text. This same form can barely be seen just after the uninstallation command goes through. Speaking to Buddy is something like a voice of reason. This is clearly whatever tricked the player before, so what exactly is it? It's not made entirely clear, but I'm fairly certain that, based on the song you earned for reaching this ending, it is Buddy's conscience. So now, I have to ask, why? How does this conscience fit into the game's ideas and themes? This is why I call the game's themes botched, because I don't think it fits at all. In the relationship metaphor, the ending should be symbolic of how people escape the kind of relationship that the game portrays, and in the game as it is, the player escapes because the conscience of their manipulator simply lets them go. If this is really the advice the game wants to give for how one might cut ties with a friend like Buddy, I truly hope no one applies it to the real world. After the game so thoroughly set up a strong allegorical side, the ending feels like a complete anticlimax in this regard. What's more frustrating is that there was, in my opinion, a simple solution to this. First, get rid of the conscience altogether. Then, make the player really play games with Buddy forever, until the player steps away. Finally, make the player willingly uninstall Buddy themselves, with Buddy ramping up the manipulative tactics to convince them to go back and be friends again. I think this would be an even stronger emotional gut punch compared to the ending as it is in the game, and it would also be so much stronger in terms of theme, as the method of escape from this dysfunctional relationship is to forcibly remove oneself, and to go against the other party's manipulation. In essence, the biggest issue with Buddy Simulator's story is that it sets itself up as a story centered around theme, but the game refuses to provide a satisfying conclusion to that part of the game, instead choosing to build on aspects of plot right at the very end. But that ending is just the start, because I still have a second point on this big issue in particular. Throughout the game's world, you can find these specific shiny pieces of decoration, and by using the shovel on them, the game places a batch file in the Documents folder on your computer. These batch files provide lore around what I believe to be the origins of the Buddy Simulator program in-universe, telling the story of an estranged father creating a game for his son Owen, a character who is alluded to in a few places throughout the game. And of course, this game matches the description of Buddy's game that they've made for you. So now, I have to ask, why? What purpose did these secrets serve to the story? It's clear that the game is attempting to build further on its plot, but is that a good trade-off if it means theme, which the game ostensibly focused on for the majority of its runtime, is left neglected by the time the game is over? And as a byproduct of introducing this plot, the game introduces another theme, of messy divorces and estranged family, that is only explored through this small part of the game, and does not mesh with the friendship aspect of the game at all. You may argue that Buddy's artificiality is in some way portrayed in these secrets through the fact that their game isn't really being made on the fly, and is at least being based on the game created by Owen's father. But this is an extremely messy and convoluted way to get that idea across, which could easily be explored to its fullest extent through the secret ending alone. In the end, Buddy Simulator abandons its excellent foundation through adding unnecessary plot details, muddying the execution of the ever so important ending, and ultimately leaves the game on a note that, for me at least, doesn't live up to its fantastic introduction. I'll finish this out with what I think is a good takeaway from all this. I think, when you write a story, one of the most important things you can keep in mind is the strengths of your story's concept at its most fundamental level. At its lowest level, Buddy Simulator is about a relationship between a person and an AI designed to be friends with them. Like many stories with AI designed to interact favorably with humans, this concept naturally lends itself to theme, and Buddy Simulator introduces itself as if that's going to be its focus. But when the endings and the secret aspects of the game seem to build on plot more than anything, that earlier focus starts to feel accidental on the author's part. This is why it's important to be aware of the true strengths of our ideas. By doing so, we can write stories with so much more depth and so much more interesting discussion to be had surrounding it. And just as a final note, I like Buddy Simulator. There's a lot more good than bad to be found in this game, but because the bad encroaches on and gets in the way of the good flourishing, it seems a lot worse than the sum of its parts. Just know that when I bother to levy this level of criticism publicly at any game, it's not out of hate for its flaws, but out of love for what it did so right.